Welcome to the Endocrine Matters podcast. This podcast episode is sponsored by Complete Medicine and Hey Healthy. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before I move on. Did your mother ever talk to you about her period and what was happening to her body, about menopause? For most of us, the answer is no. Maybe she mentioned it once in passing with a level of discomfort that made you understand immediately, this is not a topic. We don't discuss this, move on, and so we did. We moved on. We learned from a very young age that women's bodies, women's pain, women's cycles, women's transitions were things to be managed quietly, privately, without complaint, without making anyone uncomfortable, without taking up too much space. I'm Dr. Arti Thangudu, endocrinologist, Menopause Society Certified Practitioner, and today, just a South Asian woman who thinks it's time we finally had this conversation out loud. Because here's what the silence has actually cost us, and I mean that both personally and clinically. Growing up South Asian, there are certain things you absorb without anyone saying them directly. They're just in the air. In the way adults lower their voices, in the way certain topics get changed so quickly you'd miss it if you blinked. One of those particular topics, periods are shameful. Not just private, but shameful, to be hidden. Definitely not to be discussed with men, with elders, with really anyone. I know women who were not allowed to go to temple during their period, who sat out of pujas and religious ceremonies, who were made to feel at the most inconvenient biological moment of their month that they were somehow impure. Think about what that teaches a young girl about her own body. That the most natural thing her body does, the thing that literally signals that she is a healthy, functioning woman, is something to be ashamed of, something to hide, something that makes her temporarily unacceptable. And if we can't talk about periods, we definitely cannot talk about perimenopause. That word didn't exist in my household growing up, and I know it didn't exist in most households. There was no framework for it, no conversation, no preparation. Women just changed, got more tired, more irritable, gained weight, and we were supposed to just blame her if she was no longer society's ideal in every way. Here's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I want to say it carefully because I love my family, and I know this came from a place of cultural context, not cruelty. I grew up believing that being a mother almost meant suffering, that womanhood and motherhood were fundamentally about self-sacrifice, about giving everything and expecting nothing in return, that happiness was not really the point. Happiness was almost suspect. Life was about duty, about not shaming the family, about doing what was required quietly without complaint. And if you spoke out, did things differently, that made you, well, difficult and loud. I remember thinking and genuinely believing that when I became a mom, life would just become hard, sort of relentlessly hard, that was what motherhood looked like. I never thought happiness was something to actively pursue, that it was even a reasonable goal, because I'd never seen it modeled that way. Perfection was the option. Complaints made you outspoken, and not in a good way. And I want to be clear, my parents are not extreme. They're not the most conservative Indian family by a long stretch, and they've grown enormously. They've changed with the times in ways I genuinely admire. But even in a relatively open household, these messages were still there, embedded in the culture, in the extended family, in the community water we all drank from. I'm telling you this because I think a lot of you listening right now recognize exactly what I'm describing, and I want you to understand how directly this connects to your health today. When you grow up being told that women's bodies are not to be discussed, when pain and struggle are framed as virtues rather than symptoms, you become an adult who does not advocate for herself at the doctor's office. You become a woman who tells her doctor she's fine when she's exhausted and gaining weight and waking up at 3 a.m. every night. You become a woman who assumes that feeling terrible in your 40s is just what happens, what's supposed to happen. What your mother went through and her mother before her, quietly, without complaint. You don't ask about perimenopause. You don't know the clinical signs. You don't know that what you're experiencing has a name, has a biological explanation, and most importantly, has treatment options. That is the health cost of cultural silence, and today we're going to break it. Let's start from the beginning. Perimenopause is a transition period before your period stops permanently. It is not a moment, it is a phase. It can last anywhere from 2 to 10 years, and it typically starts in your 40s, sometimes even your late 30s. During this time, your estrogen levels don't just drop, they fluctuate wildly, up and down, sometimes within the same week. This is why perimenopause can feel so chaotic and unpredictable. Your hormones are not steadily declining. They're moving unsteadily, and estrogen, it turns out, does a lot more than people realize. It's not just a reproductive hormone. Estrogen affects your brain, your sleep, your mood, your metabolism, your cardiovascular system, your bones, your bladder, your skin, which is why when it starts fluctuating, you may feel like your body is suddenly doing something completely different, and nobody told you that this would happen or why. South Asian women enter this transition earlier. Here's the part that most South Asian women have never been told by their doctors. We go through menopause earlier than white women, significantly earlier. The average age of menopause in white American women is 51. For South Asian women, the Masala study, which I mentioned in our last episode, found a mean age of menopause of 48, 3 years earlier. And nearly 1 in 3 South Asian women in that study experienced premature or early menopause, meaning their periods stop before age 45. Data from India shows it's even earlier there. Mean age of menopause around 46, with early menopause rates of over 20%. So why does this matter? Because earlier menopause means earlier symptoms of perimenopause and earlier diabetes and cardiovascular risk. A large pooled analysis of over 300,000 women found that menopause before 50 was independently associated with significantly higher risk of heart disease, and the earlier it happened, the higher the risk. So if you're a South Asian woman in your early 40s who's been having irregular periods, not sleeping well, and feeling inexplicably anxious, you may already be in perimenopause. And that is not just a quality of life issue. That is a cardiovascular health issue. That is a metabolic health issue. That deserves your attention and your doctor's attention. Let's talk about what perimenopause actually feels like, because I promise you, it's not always what you think. Yes, there can be hot flashes. The Masala study found that about 30% of South Asian American women reported hot flashes. So they happen, but compared to Black women who have the highest rates and longest duration of hot flashes of any group, and even compared to white women, South Asian women tend to report them somewhat less frequently. What South Asian women do report at higher rates are things that often get dismissed or attributed to something else entirely. Sleep disruption, waking up at 2 or 3 a.m., not being able to fall back asleep. Asian women overall report sleeplessness as the most common menopausal symptom, more common than hot flashes. Musculoskeletal symptoms, joint pains, body aches, feeling like you aged 10 years overnight. This is one of the most commonly reported symptoms in South Asian women specifically, and one of the least discussed in Western medicine. Mood changes, anxiety, irritability, low mood, difficulty concentrating, that brain fog that makes you feel like your sharpness is slipping. The Masala study found that 15% of South Asian postmenopausal women reported depressive symptoms. Urinary symptoms. The same Masala study found that 37% of South Asian postmenopausal women reported urinary leakage, nearly 4 in 10. That is not a small number, and it is almost never discussed because talking about leaking when you sneeze is definitely not on the approved list of things South Asian women discuss at family gatherings. And then there's the huge metabolic piece. Estrogen plays a role in how your body processes insulin, where you store fat, and how your cholesterol behaves. When estrogen fluctuates and eventually drops, we see increases in central belly fat, visceral fat, increases in LDL cholesterol, decreases in HDL, and worsening insulin resistance. For South Asian women, who, as we discussed last episode, already carry more visceral fat and higher metabolic risk at baseline, perimenopause compounds an already elevated starting point. This is not meant to scare you. It is meant to explain why this transition deserves clinical attention and not silence. There's one more thing I have to mention before we get to what you can do, and that's vitamin D. Studies show that 70 to 90% of South Asian women are vitamin D deficient. This is partly because of sun avoidance, and yes, we talked last episode about the cultural pressure to stay out of the sun to preserve skin tone. That has real metabolic consequences. Vitamin D is made in your skin in response to sunlight, and when you avoid sun and don't supplement, deficiency is almost guaranteed. Also, melanin protects our skin from absorbing sunlight, which prevents us from getting wrinkles, skin cancer, but also adequate vitamin D. During perimenopause, vitamin D deficiency matters more than ever. It is associated with accelerated bone loss, higher fracture risk, worsened sleep, more depression, more musculoskeletal pain, all the symptoms that South Asian women are already reporting at high rates. Maintaining vitamin D levels is important alongside adequate calcium intake. Get your vitamin D level checked. If it is low, and statistically it probably is, supplement. This is one of the simplest, most evidence-based things you can do for your bone health and your mood during perimenopause. Remember, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, so you don't want to take too much, but taking the right amount can make a huge difference. I need to say something that should be obvious, but given everything we just talked about, maybe it isn't. You are allowed to not feel well and say so out loud. You are allowed to go to your doctor and say, I am not sleeping, I am exhausted, I am anxious in a way that I don't recognize, my joints hurt, my periods are changing. I need to understand what is happening. You're allowed to ask about hormone therapy, about treatment, about options. You do not have to white knuckle your way through a decade of symptoms because suffering quietly is what women in your family have always done. Times have changed, and I say this with so much love for the generation before us. We are not our mothers. We don't have to inherit their silence along with everything else they gave us. Here's what to ask for at your next appointment. 1. Ask to discuss perimenopause specifically, not just hormones or mood. Name the transition. Tell your doctor your age, your symptoms, and your family history of early menopause. If they're not familiar with perimenopause, which they may not be since it isn't part of medical school curricula, find a doctor who is a certified menopause practitioner through the North American Menopause Society. 2. Ask about ethnicity-specific risk. South Asian women go through menopause earlier, and that earlier transition carries cardiovascular implications. Ask if your cardiovascular risk is being assessed with that in mind, including lipid panels, blood pressure, and blood sugar. 3. Ask for a vitamin D level, and if it's low, ask about a supplementation protocol. Some insurances don't like to cover vitamin D. Through our clinic, it costs something like $20, so it is not a super expensive test. So if your insurance isn't covering it, ask your doctor for the cash price on it. 4. Ask about hormone therapy. Not to commit to it, but to have an informed conversation about whether you're a candidate. The evidence is clear that hormone therapy started within 10 years of menopause or before age 60 has a very different and generally favorable risk profile compared to starting later. 5. Tell your doctor about every symptom, including the ones that feel embarrassing. The urinary leakage, the joint pain, the 3 a.m. wake-ups, the anxiety, the concerns about your libido and sex life. These are clinical symptoms, and they deserve clinical attention. I want to close by going back to something I said at the beginning. I grew up believing that life was supposed to be hard, that happiness wasn't really the goal, duty was, sacrifice was, not complaining was. I thought that was just what becoming a woman and mother meant. I don't believe that anymore, and I want you to not believe it either. Your health and happiness are not luxuries. Feeling well is not something you earn by suffering enough first. You are allowed and actually encouraged to understand what is happening to your own body, to ask for help, to get treatment, and to feel better. The silence that surrounded our mothers' bodies was not wisdom. It was a gap in medical research, in cultural conversation, in the basic permission for women to be seen as full human beings whose physical experience matters. We get to close that gap for ourselves and our daughters, starting now, starting in conversations like this one. I'm Dr. Arti Thangudu. Follow me on Instagram at Dr. Arti Thangudu, just my name, for more evidence-based content on women's hormonal health. Subscribe to Endocrine Matters wherever you listen, and if this episode resonated, share it with one woman in your life in her 40s who is confused about what her body is doing. She deserves to know this. So did we 10 years ago, but better late than never.